Good morning and welcome to our second in this series of heat source webinars entitled Heat in the Highlands and Islands. This morning's session is specifically focused on our island communities and audience. It's titled A Data-Driven Approach to Clean Heat, which we'll hear more of shortly from our first speaker, Keith Masson from Highlands and Islands Enterprise. Will then be followed by Stuart Gilfinnan from SSEN. Please do post any questions in the chat box as we go, and then we'll have the Q&A towards the end of the session. My name is Tom Warren. I work for Built Environment Smart Transformation, and we're delivering the heat source programme in partnership with our funders Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and South of Scotland Enterprise. Heat source is a programme to support clean heat within Scotland, specifically focusing on the supply chain. It's technology agnostic, so we engage and welcome conversations with all within the clean heat supply chain world, regardless of technologies or kind of roles within that sector. Heat source is a collaborative knowledge hub, bringing together those supply chain partners and delivering webinars and other events to disseminate best practice for the sector. Key is to increase capacity and capability of the sector to support the transition towards net zero. It's a pan-Scotland approach, obviously supported by all three enterprise agencies in Scotland, which is fantastic. And like today's session provides opportunities for engagement and network, and if you haven't, please do sign up to our newsletter, which comes out once a month. If you're within the industry, you may have news you wish to share with us, so we'd be delighted to have conversations around that, and follow us on social media. If you haven't already and you're within the clean heat world, do get in touch to arrange a one-to-one conversation to see how Heat Source and the agencies can support you further. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Keith Masson.
Thanks very much, Tom. Good morning to you all. I'm very grateful to Heat Source for the opportunity to speak with you all today. Very briefly, and by way of background for those of you on the call who I haven't met, my name is Keith Masson and I'm Head of Net Zero Transition at Highlands and Islands Enterprise. So as many of you will already know, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, or HIE, is the economic development agency for the north of Scotland and for all of its islands. So our area covers everywhere from Shetland in the north down through Orkney and into Highland, with Moray to the east, Argyll and Bute to the south, and in Arran, Arran and the Cumbraes to the west. And we are funded by the Scottish Government and are here really to provide help and support to the businesses and the communities of our areas through our area teams predominantly, really to help them grow, to thrive and to be resilient. And as you'll all be aware, every area, every town, every city and village of Scotland has its own unique opportunities and challenges. And we're really here to try and help maximise those opportunities and reduce the number of challenges that our places have. And in terms of my role, it's really pretty straightforward. First of all, from an operational perspective, I act as a lead to put high on a credible pathway to net zero across all of our emissions sources, from decarbonising our buildings, through how our staff travel, to deliver the services that we offer, through to how we procure our own goods and services. But secondly, and probably more excitingly, working through our area teams, I support our businesses and communities to get on board with and benefit from the transition to net zero, whilst also encouraging them to increasingly think about their resilience in the face of more extreme weather. Anyway, for the next 20 minutes or so, we're diving into the white knuckle world of greenhouse gas emissions and what that profile looks like across the region, with a particular focus on heat. And to me, what I'm going to present and the data that you'll see isn't really about carbon footprints and pie charts. It's a secret ingredient for crafting the future economy of the region in many ways. So I hope you're all well prepared and ready to be blown away by the surprisingly thrilling world of emissions data. But before all that, and just in terms of context as to why I'm here today, back in 2023, HIE recognised the need to develop a more robust assessment of regional emissions to progress and inform both our own strategy, which was recently published, but also to ensure that our work with partners was more targeted and to focus on the clear areas of need around emissions reduction across the whole Highlands and Islands. And as a result of that, we commissioned EcosGen to undertake work to baseline the regional greenhouse gas emissions profile for the Highlands and Islands region overall, for its constituent local authority areas, as well as for the carbon sequestration and renewable energy potential that we have at our disposal right across the region. And I'll now briefly summarise the findings from this research. Next slide, please, Tom. So to kick off, and for context, you'll all be aware that in 2019, the Scottish Government declared a global climate emergency and recognised that to address that is going to require transformational change right across all sectors of the economy. And following that declaration, the target to end Scotland's contribution to climate change was moved forward 5 years, from 2050 to 2045, really recognising that Scotland was in a naturally stronger position to decarbonise more rapidly than other parts of the UK. Now, the Scottish Government have tasked public sector organisations like HI and our local authorities with helping them to achieve the country's net zero target. And a big part of that, and hence why this report was produced, involves organisations developing an understanding of where, why, and how greenhouse gas emissions arise in their day-to-day operations and through their supply chains. Because fundamentally, that old adage is true, you can't manage what you don't measure. So having a thorough understanding, not just of our own operational footprint, but the footprint of the region, is a critical first step towards evidence-based collaborative action. So in terms of what the study is telling us, at a very high level, the Highlands and Islands greenhouse gas emissions account for about 15% of Scotland's total, despite us having less than 10% of the population. And although our emissions have declined since 2005, we as a region are lagging behind Scotland in terms of overall progress. In terms of our emissions, we've got fairly significant sub-regional variation, with emissions being highest for the Highland region and lowest for Argyll and Bute. And finally, if we look at this in terms of our population, our per capita emissions are considerably higher than nationally. Again, there's quite a lot of sub-regional variation apparent there, with only Argyll and Bute having more per capita emissions than for Scotland overall, and our islands having significantly higher per capita emissions than Scotland and the regional average. And later slides will explain why that's the case. Next slide, please, Tom. So if we look at the emissions profile for the region, and this is effectively our baseline, the top 5 sources of emissions do reflect those of Scotland overall, but the order and the scale is quite different. Now, before getting into that, I'm sure at least some of you are thinking this if previous groups have presented this to or anything to go by. What do we mean by LULUCF? LULUCF stands for land use change and forestry. And the LULUCF sector covers emissions and removals of greenhouse gases resulting from direct human-induced land-based activities. So in very simple terms, carbon is sequestered or locked away by forestry and grassland, whilst carbon losses occur on existing cropland and natural land that's converted over to cropland or to settlement. And for the Highlands and Islands, agriculture and LULUCF account for almost half of our total emissions, about 48%, whilst the other 3 categories of transport, domestic and industry account for a similar proportion, about 46%. And in terms of national emissions, I think the key takeaway here is that we're making a disproportionate contribution to both LULUCF and agriculture, 51% and 20% respectively. But for the other sources, our contribution is broadly proportionate to our population share. And just one final point to note on this slide. It's an important one too. The public sector contributes a very small proportion to the overall emissions arising in the region. So despite us being legislatively required to meet Scotland's 2045 target, if we do so, it won't massively shift the dial in terms of whether the region gets to net zero or not. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, before we get into a more specific discussion around what the data is telling us from a heat perspective, it's really important to understand the sub-regional variation in emissions across the Highlands and Islands. Now, that's largely because there are so many interdependencies between the regions, and the fundamental reality is that net zero will only be possible by taking a collaborative pan-regional approach. What do I mean by that? Some regions are going to need to play a disproportionate role in emissions removals or carbon sequestration if we're going to achieve a net zero position for the whole high area. In addition to that, it's likely that the supply chain and the installer base for heat decarbonisation works in particular is likely to grow most in larger population centres, but will likely have an important role right across the region. So from this slide, you'll note that there are some fairly significant variations in our emissions profile. For some areas, we see the dominance of particular emissions sources. For Shetland and the Western Isles, for example, that's LULUCF. For Orkney and for Argyll and Bute, it's agriculture. Highland and Murray have much greater breadth in terms of those emission subsectors and their contributions. For Highland, transport contributes the most, but LULUCF and agriculture closely follow. And in Murray, unsurprisingly in many ways, industry is the dominant source of emissions, but agriculture isn't terribly far behind. But what we also see for the likes of Argyll and Bute and Murray is where land management can make a significant difference to the emissions profile of an area. In both of those areas, forestry is already sequestering carbon and helping to balance the emissions from other sectors. Next slide, please, Tom. So now on to something that touches us all, and I think one of the key challenges and opportunities of the coming decades. The inescapable conclusion is that reducing the emissions we generate from running our homes and our businesses is going to be critical to achieve a net zero position regionally, but is going to be quite a significant challenge for the Highlands and Islands. For the purposes of this study, we assessed the two primary sources of energy which is used in residential properties. That's electricity and fossil fuels for heat. Whilst our domestic emissions are proportionate in the round to our share of Scotland's dwellings, we're going to have a harder job than the rest of Scotland to bring our homes up to appropriate energy efficiency standards. Currently, only about a quarter of dwellings within the Highlands and Islands have an EPC rating of C or above, compared to 2/5 nationally. Now, there are a few different factors that drive that, including the age, construction, and the nature of our housing stock. But we also have a greater reliance on fossil fuels, such as oil and coal for heating, and a higher proportion of our properties suffer from exposure to wind-driven rain and are in very severe exposure zones, which means it takes more energy to heat our homes. And that's partly why we have higher levels of fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty within the region. The overriding message from this analysis, though, is that much of the region's emissions arise from a dependency on carbon-intensive fossil fuels, particularly for space heating, but also in industrial and manufacturing processes. So for many of our areas, the remoteness from on-grid energy supply and the quality and the age of our building stock, whether that's commercial premises or residential dwellings, is a major contributory factor in energy consumption and therefore our carbon emissions profile. And for residential dwellings in particular, energy efficiency, insulation, and transition to low carbon means of heating and lighting is an area of critical focus and a huge opportunity for our business base going forward if we look at this positively. But a significant challenge to the financial and greenhouse gas emission savings arising from energy efficiency is the lack of a local supply chain that can undertake that work. And that's already impacting on the ability to reduce stationary energy use and greenhouse gas emissions in the Highlands and Islands, as well as householders and businesses' ability to benefit from national funding, such as that offered by Home Energy Scotland and Business Energy Scotland. However, and there is a common theme that underpins a lot of the work that we've done here, this is a largely untapped opportunity within the region. So to me, our analysis, coupled with aggregated up household data at a place-based level, really starts to paint a strong picture of the economic opportunity around clean heat and retrofit. So we need to provide confidence to current installers and potential new entrants to the market that there's a credible and largely untapped 15 to 20-year pipeline of work just waiting to be realised right across the region. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, it'll come as no surprise to any of you on the call today that we have a high proportion of older dwellings within the Highlands and Islands. Currently, about 21% of our total dwellings are pre-1919, compared to 18% nationally. Now, in addition to the higher proportion of older dwellings in the region, there's also a higher proportion of houses with poor or no wall insulation. For example, 50% of our properties have insulated walls compared to 58% across the whole of Scotland. And dwellings in island and remote rural parts of the region are less likely to have insulated walls, 46% and 45% do, than those in accessible rural, 59%, small towns, 52%, and urban, 52% locations. So dwellings in the Highlands and Islands are more likely to have solid walls as well, 31% do, and solid floors, 22% do, than dwellings across Scotland, where 26% have solid walls and 17% have solid floors. So the combination of a high proportion of older dwellings with solid walls and floors and that are less likely to have wall insulation results in a housing stock in the region that may be less energy efficient than the housing stock of Scotland overall. And additionally, those dwellings are likely to be the least suited to current retrofitting processes, or at the very least require more expensive interventions. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, this slide shows the main fuel type by sub-region in the Highlands and Islands. And although mains gas is the most common fuel type in the region, electricity and oil account for a significant proportion of the heat sources for residential properties, particularly in non-gas grid areas. And the reliance on high carbon fuel sources like heating oil and solid fuels presents an acute issue in terms of domestic carbon emissions, particularly given the high proportion of dwellings in island, remote rural and accessible rural areas that rely on such fuel as their main fuel type. And that issue is further exacerbated when we consider that about a fifth of dwellings in the Highlands and Islands use such fuels as their secondary fuel type as well. So when we consider energy efficiency and alternative fuel measures, the extent to which owner-occupiers and private landlords can be influenced is going to be a critical factor. And research that was undertaken by h-Eileanan back in 2022 indicated that only 6% of households were planning to switch their fuel type over the next 2 to 3 years. And for those who weren't planning to switch, the barriers that they cited included cost, about 53%, not wanting to change, 34%, and a lack of financial support from the government, 30%, as the main barriers to switching fuel types. So just to try and summarise what the research is telling us in terms of heat, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that emissions from residential dwellings are considerably higher per dwelling than for elsewhere in Scotland. Our mean emissions per dwelling are 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in the Highlands and Islands against a figure of 4.3 tonnes carbon dioxide equivalent per dwelling in Scotland overall, so about 50% higher. And as highlighted by this in the previous slide, it's the age, the nature and the condition of our housing stock, as well as the differences in the main fuel and heating systems that's really driving that additional higher contribution to residential emission rates in the region. And that's also compounded by the proportion of dwellings in island and remote areas. Just under 2/3 of the region's residential dwellings are in remote areas, making the rollout and uptake of energy efficiency or sustainability measures more difficult to achieve at scale. And that also means that many of the region's dwellings are in exposed or very exposed locations, and their exposure to wind-driven rain is an influencing factor in their energy consumption as well as their energy efficiency. So consequently, many of the factors that distinguish the Highlands and Islands from the rest of Scotland mean that by comparative measures, we do have a higher greenhouse gas emissions footprint, namely a disparate population, our geography and remoteness, the climate that we experience, and greater exposure to wind-driven rain, increased our reliance on carbon-intensive fossil fuels, and more energy-intensive industries in certain areas, for example, whisky distilling, mean that there is still a very heavy reliance on fossil fuels for our heat. So those factors underline, I think, the scale of the challenge in tackling greenhouse gas emissions within our business base and across the residential sector. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I do only have a couple more slides to run through, you'll be pleased to hear. But I think it would be remiss not to mention the potential impact and the scale of renewable energy generation in the region. It really can't be understated. And without it, national targets, both in terms of decarbonisation and more particularly relevant to this call, greening heat, are unlikely to be met. And whilst we see at the moment onshore wind is currently the largest source of renewable generation across the region, we're expecting offshore wind to increase to a far greater scale than all the other technologies. Saying that, we do also expect significant increases in the generation and the supply and storage capacity across nearly all renewable energy technologies over the coming years, which is massively exciting for the region and a huge economic opportunity. And if all the current pipeline activity is realised, the generation capacity across the Highlands and Islands will increase more than fourfold, with growth in all parts of the region. And that's largely because of the natural competitive advantage that the Highlands Islands has, and is going to, I think, inevitably result in significant opportunities throughout the life cycle of projects, and is going to increase demand for other services exponentially over the coming years. Next slide, please, Tom. So I just want to summarise very quickly some of the really interesting work that partners are undertaking in terms of heat decarbonisation across our islands and on the mainland too, in some cases. The first thing to mention is LHEES, which is local heat and energy efficiency strategies, which each local authority in Scotland has a duty to prepare, to publish and to update at least every 5 years. And essentially, what these strategies and their associated delivery plans seek to do is create a data-led approach to decarbonising heat and improving the energy efficiency of buildings across the area they cover. And this has required assessment of a range of data from multiple sources to assess the best and the most appropriate solutions at a place-based level, whether that be in relation to district heat, insulation measures, the shift from fossil fuels to heat pumps, etc. So LHEES, alongside the work that we've undertaken and some of the work that Stuart will talk about shortly, are really critical components in both stimulating market response to need around the shift to clean heat, but also the ability to do so in a well-evidenced, thoughtful way. The Carbon Neutral Islands programme, which was initiated by the Scottish Government, aims to support 6 islands in achieving carbon neutrality by 2040, so 5 years ahead of national ambition. And the CNI initiative not only focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also emphasises the importance of replicability. So by developing and implementing effective decarbonisation strategies on these islands, the programme is seeking to create models that can be replicated across other Scottish islands and beyond. And that approach really is going to ensure that the lessons learned and best practices can be shared widely, really amplifying the impact of the programme and contributing to broader climate action efforts. And a big focus for CNI, unsurprisingly, is decarbonising heat, both for householders, for community assets and for businesses. And £1 million has been allocated by the Scottish Government this financial year to move the programme forward. And you should all be expecting an announcement on the supported projects from CNI at the end of this month. In terms of ICNZ, or the Island Centre for Net Zero, it's a collaborative initiative aimed at supporting Orkney, Shetland and the Outer Hebrides in their transition to low carbon economies. And the ICNZ's focus is really on exploring, trialling and accelerating solutions for decarbonisation, really with the goal of making those island groups global leaders in renewable energy. And there is going to be a big focus through ICNZ on clean heat, particularly in relation to rollout of smart meters and making sure that the islands can keep pace with the mainland in terms of decarbonising heat. In terms of other support available, Business Energy Scotland, or BES, provides fairly comprehensive support to help businesses improve their energy efficiency and to reduce carbon emissions. And their initiatives include free advice and support, so offering guidance on energy saving measures and decarbonisation strategies for businesses. They have an SME loan scheme, so can provide up to £100,000 interest-free loan funding and cashback grants for energy efficiency projects, including renewable heat technologies like heat pumps and biomass. And they also have a suite of training and resources which can help businesses upskill their staff to make sure that they can be most resource efficient and reduce carbon emissions right across the business. And just finally, Energy Saving Trust. And for those of you who are attending webinar 2, either next week or the following, you'll find out a bit more about their offer then. But they do have a fantastic suite of support and resources for businesses who are working on energy efficiency, heating systems, and renewable generation schemes, with a lot of upskilling offers currently on the table. So do join next week's webinar or the one after that if you're keen to find out more about the offer from EST. Next slide, please, Tom. So my final slide. The research that I've summarised is extremely detailed, and this has only been and could ever only be a high-level overview. But what I hope the research does is provide a really strong baseline of greenhouse gas emissions for the region and a more evidenced understanding of where we need to target efforts to really shift the dial in terms of emissions reduction. And on this slide, what I've tried to do is summarise the critical next steps that we see as important both for HI, but also for the Highlands and Islands Regional Economic Partnership, or HIREP, if we're going to see a significant downward trend in emissions when it comes to repeating this exercise in future years. And the work highlights a range of considerations and emerging priority areas which are important for the evolving regional economic strategy, as well as for HI's own approach to transitioning to net zero. And to me, and I would hope many of you on the call will agree, net zero isn't going to happen if we continue on the current trajectory of attempting to address it as individual organisations, businesses or householders. It's going to need much more sophistication, better coordination and aggregation of data to inform more place-based approaches. Over and above that, and coupled with the generation of a lot more renewable energy across the region, it's inescapable that we're going to need a strategic approach to deliver a strengthened distribution network to accommodate the shift to renewable heat, not to mention the uptake of electric vehicles. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Stuart at SSEN in terms of their own work in that respect and how we can all productively and proactively feed into it. Thank you all very much for your attention this morning, and I'll now pass back to Tom and be very happy to take any questions later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Lots of information there, and hopefully lots of food for thought for the Q&A in due course. Again, just a reminder, if you've got any questions you want to ask as we go, please put them in the chat. Great. So I will now hand over to Stuart from SSEN. Stuart's joining us audio only today, so hopefully we'll hear Stuart in a moment.
Hi, morning everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Tom, and thanks to Keith also for his presentation and for teeing me up so nicely there as well. Apologies, having some camera issues today, so it's just audio from me today. But yeah, my name's Stuart Gilfillan. I work for Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, SSEN, in our distribution business. What I'm looking to do today really is just give you a bit of background on our strategic network planning process, how this relates to decarbonisation of heat. I'll touch briefly as well on some of the island-specific work that we're doing, and then I'll throughout hopefully cover how you can get involved in all of those processes. So next slide, please. Yeah, so I just want to start with a very quick bit of background, and apologies if this is old news to you and you've seen it before. But we at SSEN are the distribution network operator, or the DNO, for the north of Scotland, with our licence area covering sort of roughly everything north of Stirling on the mainland and the vast majority of the inhabited islands in Scotland. So a DNO owns, operates and maintains the distribution network that carries electricity from the higher voltage transmission network down through the various voltage levels and then ultimately to your homes and businesses. Just want to pick out on this slide this part at the bottom around low carbon technologies and the change in the way the network's being used, as that's really a key point that's changed the way in which we have to operate, which I'll expand upon on the next slide. Yeah, so this change in the way that the network's being used has led to, I suppose, a transition from the traditional position of a distribution network operator to more of a distribution system operator model. You may have heard the DSO acronym bandied about quite a lot recently. But basically in this DSO model, we look to take a whole system view of the wider energy picture and the network's role within that, which is really essential to, first of all, driving performance and efficiency from the network, but also highlights the need for our network to respond to increasing low carbon technology demands like heat pump, EVs, distributed generation, it's all increasing exponentially, which means we need to take a more strategic approach to planning out the network and particularly forecasting what the future requirements of the network are going to be. And it's really this point I want to talk you through today in the green circle on our little DSO bubble there around forecasting and planning future needs of the network, of which decarbonising heat is clearly a key consideration. Next slide, please. The team I work with within this DSO, distribution system operator function, is the whole system team. And what we're responsible for is the longer term strategic planning of the network to respond to local requirements. And we look to do this really through the strategic planning process on the screen here. This, I'm aware, is quite a busy slide. I believe it will be shared afterwards though, but I'll run through it quickly just now. So developing future forecasts is really the base on which our strategic planning process is built. And this is primarily done through our DFES, our Distribution Future Energy Scenarios model. So what the DFES is, it's really a giant data model that's built on insights provided to us by local stakeholders on what they're planning for their local area. We combine these insights with our own connections data and research done by a consultant, Regen, to create modeled scenarios of what we think growth on our network will look like out to 2050. This is my first plug for input from you for the day. It won't be the last, but as with all data models, the outputs that we get from this DFES are only as good as the inputs. So we're constantly looking to refine that with any data and insights that people within the local areas can give us. So using these DFES projections, we then create something called strategic development plans, which you're going to be hearing a lot more from us in the future about as we roll this out. But essentially what we look to do in these strategic development plans is create a high-level plan for how the network will respond to changes in demands, and then work through various options to try and meet these requirements. So stakeholder consultation is really a key part of this process on the plans. The first batch of our strategic development plans are due out for consultation this month, and they will cover a fair few of the island groups that we're talking about today. So yeah, please watch this space, as comments on those plans are very much encouraged and appreciated. So the high-level options that are identified in those strategic development plans are then developed into more detailed options to address the capacity needs that have been identified, with the decisions that are made then being published as part of our distribution network options assessment process. And again, another acronym, I apologize, it's a very acronym-heavy industry. But then once the projects have been developed and consulted on through this process, they then move forward to delivery to actually deliver the capacity that is required in local areas on the network. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I just wanted to emphasize the point on this slide that we're really reliant on network users sharing their insights and future requirements with us to help develop both the high-level DFES scenarios, but also to enhance that sort of more regionally specific information that we need for the strategic development plan documents. Point to make is that these strategic development plan documents are living documents that we'll aim to update at least annually. So if you have data or plans, particularly as you look longer into the future that are a little more uncertain, I'd really encourage you to please don't be hesitant. Do still share them with us. This is not like I suppose a connection application process that you're committing to here, where you need to have a really good idea of what you're doing. We're really just trying to get a two-way information sharing situation going here, in which we can facilitate a process in which your future plans inform our future plans, and vice versa. Next slide, please. Yeah, very quickly, just to touch on this. So a tool we are developing as part of our strategic energy planning process is the Local Energy Net Zero Accelerator, or LHEES tool. So this tool has been designed to help local authorities develop strategic plans for net zero. and to help give them a platform to give us as the network operator visibility of those plans. So what LHEES is, it's a geospatial planning tool that we believe can provide users with the data that they need to make informed decisions about the where and the when of new energy assets and how they can be most effectively planned. One caveat to make, at the moment the tool is in a beta development phase, so we can only offer access to local authorities in our license areas at the moment, but we're actively exploring options for expanding this access further. So with that in mind, if you are a local authority within our license area and haven't yet got access, please reach out. But also, if you're not with a local authority, but feel this platform could be of use to you in developing your future energy plans, and as a way of informing network planning, please also reach out as we look to understand where there's a needs case for expanding access. Just one last point on the LHEES tool before I move on. What I would say is that we think this tool can be a really useful tool in the process, but it's not the be all and end all. So if you'd prefer a format where you just have a more informal conversation with us initially, please reach out. Likewise, if you already feel you've developed plans in more detail and you want to go through them with us, then we'd be really keen to have that conversation too. So again, please reach out. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is another catchy acronym that we have in the industry, HOUSEM we call it, which is the Hebrides and Orkney Whole System Uncertainty Mechanism. And I just wanted to briefly touch on this today, given its relevance on the island focus of this call. But what this does is HOUSEM provides us with a funding route to propose works to enhance the capacity, reliability and resilience of some of our key island connection routes. So to support this though, as we talked about earlier with all of our works, strategic analysis is essential, and we really need to focus on the whole system requirements through to 2045 and beyond. Excuse me. So the islands that are in scope for the Hebrides and Orkney Whole System Uncertainty Mechanism, as the name might suggest, are the Inner Hebrides, split into two island groups, Mulcaulterree and Islay-Jura-Colonsay, the Outer Hebrides, and then the Orkney Islands. As a way of a brief update, we submitted initial plans for the Outer Hebrides to our regulator Ofgem in January this year, with a follow-up cost submission submitted in July, and we'll be submitting further plans for the remaining island groups in January 2025. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just a little bit more about where this HOUSEM project has come from. And there are really four key points that are the drivers for change in this process, which I think can provide some useful context on kind of our approach to islands. Firstly, a key driver is the future demand and generation requirements for the islands. We clearly need to ensure our networks are appropriately sized to meet the needs of those wanting to connect and use our assets. And to do this, we're assessing the future needs using our DFES forecast that I mentioned earlier and collaborating with local stakeholders to gain deeper insights. Second driver is subsea cable asset condition. And a really key task for us is maintaining and replacing submarine cables as needed. As I'm sure you can imagine, some of these cables operate in very extreme environmental conditions. And if a failure does occur, it can take months to locate and repair them, or in some cases, completely replace them. Building on that point, a third driver is around continued island resilience. So we recognise that the resilience picture on Scottish Islands is unique due to geography, ultimately. And long system outages are a possibility in the rare event of subsea cable faults. So we've developed policies specifically for these islands, recognising the impact of wide-scale decarbonisation on our network. And final driver is around decarbonisation of our diesel generation fleet. So as some of you probably know, we do operate diesel generation stations on a number of our islands in case of cable failure. And so diesel generation is a major source of carbon emissions for us, especially when run for extended periods during outages. So a key priority for us, in line with our science-based target, is to reduce reliance on diesel generation, but also keeping in mind that balance with the resilience piece that I mentioned previously. Next slide, please. Yeah, so again, a bit of a busy slide maybe, but this slide covers the planning process that we've followed through HOUSEM. Again, the slides will be shared, so I won't labor on it too much in the interest of time. But as you can see, our process takes us from that early insights and forecasting piece right through to the detailed plans and regulatory submission, which is where we're at or getting towards at this stage in the HOUSEM process. So, as I briefly mentioned earlier, there's consultations on the strategic development plans related to these HOUSEM island groups, which will be out later this month. So please do watch out for that. And again, just to emphasize, we would welcome feedback on them. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's pretty much me. That's been a whistle-stop tour of the Hebrides and Orkney whole system uncertainty mechanism and our strategic planning process more widely. I realise I've not specifically focused on decarbonisation of heat as the title of today's webinar suggests, but it's clearly a key consideration for us in our network planning alongside various other factors, your generation, transport, new development, many other energy vectors. But I'd just like to finish by encouraging you again to reach out to us via this email if you'd like to discuss our energy planning or your own energy planning further. And yeah, watch out for consultations that are coming out later this month, as your feedback is very valuable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. That was great. Lots of information there again, and as Stuart said, the slides will be shared with you all afterwards. I'd like to invite Keith, Stuart, to stay on the call, and Keith to come back on screen if you can. And we're just going to take some questions from the chat here. So first one up, quite a chunky one. I'm not sure whether Keith or Stuart want to take this. Is where, or maybe, yeah, where should the regional economic partnership across the Highlands and Islands, you know, how can that be supporting clean heat, or where should that be moving with clean heat? Who wants to lead on that?
I'm happy to jump in there, Tom. So
Yeah.
I think the IREP is going to have a critical role in terms of clean heat. And just for those on the call who are maybe not aware of what the IREP is, it's a body which is constituted of all the local authorities from the Highlands and Islands area. But in addition to that, the likes of UHI, Visit Scotland, Skills Development Scotland, Federation of Small Businesses, HIE, High Transit, etc. So a really big group of organizations who clearly have their own strategic approach and priorities, but the thinking is that, you know, bringing those organizations together where there is a clear need for shared and collaborative action is the right mechanism to deliver the best economic outcomes for the region. So a large focus of the HIREP's work is going to be in realizing the ambition around the generation of renewable energy. But over and above that too, you know, the HIREP is seeking to address the housing challenges, both from the build out of new properties to meet the economic opportunity in front of us. But to me, at least, and it's certainly coming through within the emerging strategy, the need to be more thoughtful around the aggregation of work, particularly through local authorities, but with support from the likes of HIE and the likes of Skills Development Scotland, to make sure that we are, as I mentioned in my slide deck, aggregating up the potential market for decarbonisation of heat across the region, so that we can provide confidence to new entrants to the market or the existing supply chain and installers that there is a good body of work here. And again, as I referenced within the slide, I think if we if we don't take that opportunity to be more thoughtful and more collective in our approach to decarbonisation of heat, it's just simply not going to happen unless we think about it in a place-based way, but recognising that need for a regional approach in terms of building a really strong and robust supply chain, then we will miss that opportunity and it'll be all the more difficult. And just one final point, and I'll shut up. The High Rep does have a really important lobbying role as well. So I think what the research is telling us is that we do have very specific challenges within the region, both from a heat decarbonisation perspective, but across other different emission sources as well. And in the absence of that data, it becomes very difficult to lobby effectively to Scottish Government, to UK Government. So the High Rep can act as a really powerful collective voice in making the case for different types of interventions that the region will need if we're going to see that ambition to meet 2045 net zero targets realised.
Thanks, Keith. A good question there, and I think hopefully that's answered it. Yeah, that sounds like a really useful group. So yeah, maybe we can also share more details of that with the audience in the follow-up. Couple of questions here for Stuart. The DSO, one of the acronyms you mentioned, as a kind of new model. I wondered, so the question here is what the opportunities for the supply chain within the Highlands and Islands there. Is there anything we can talk to that about?
So I suppose, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I suppose opportunities in terms of supply chain for the sort of build out and stuff of assets going forward probably still sits more with the traditional DNO aspect of the organisation in terms of actual delivery of works on the ground. DSO is more around that forecasting and planning in order to have the best picture possible to plan out those works as they come. So in terms of opportunity for supply chain from DSO itself, they're probably a little more limited than they would be from the traditional DNO. Though what I would say is I think the opportunities locally with DSO are more around collaboration on building those plans and building those pictures, but also around so the innovation part of our business sits within DSO as well, and they're always on the lookout for potential project partners for, well, specifically innovation projects related to innovation on the network, as you can imagine, given the nature of our business. But they're always on the lookout, particularly for more, perhaps what you might call more niche, more localized projects, but things that could then be learned from and replicated in other parts of the country across the network. So there's a real opportunity for collaboration there on innovation projects, and we have access to a number of funding pots via our regulator Ofgem, if we can make a compelling case for those innovation projects. But local partners are one of the key things that they look for as part of those projects. So I feel like a broken record here, but if you've got ideas, if you've got projects, things that you think you'd like to talk to us about, please reach out, because we've got a very, very active innovation team who would be keen to talk to you about that.
Yeah, that's great, Stuart. And I think that was coming loud and clear that, yeah, you're here to engage with and to listen, particularly from that, very localized opportunities. So the other question again for Stuart is around Lensa, which is fantastic looking platform. Appreciate you said it's at beta stage. The question here is when can that be accessed by those other than local authorities? I think you said. So is there a timescale for a further rollout, and then maybe commercial partners being able to access that and things?
There's no timescale for that yet. I'd say that we're at the understanding the needs case stage. So it's again pretty much everything that we do as a regulated business has to go through our regulator for approval. So we're currently, our funding is approved just to give local authorities in our license area access at the moment. So in order to roll that out further, we need to understand the needs case and have a very strong evidence base to present to the regulator that it's in the best interest ultimately of the bill payer for funding to be used on rolling that out further. So I'm going to say it again. if you think there's a needs case for your non-local authority organisation, be really keen to discuss that.
Okay, and is that contact again through the email address?
Yeah. I would just use that as your first point of contact for everything, and
yeah, fantastic.
Can direct as required.
Okay, and I'm not sure if this is a question from someone on Sky, but the house sum, the question is Sky and maybe also the small isles. Are they within scope, or are they dealt with in a different way?
No, they're not within scope for our ability to request funding as part of that uncertainty mechanism. What I would say though is Sky specifically, given the topography of our network, which you might be aware of, the Outer Hebridean Islands are fed from Sky. Therefore, in our more wide strategic development plan that will sit behind our funding submission, Sky forms a key part of that strategic development plan. So later this month, when that's released for consultation, you'll be able to see that the way in which the network on Sky is being considered in relation to this funding bid for the Outer Hebrides, but also in relation to distribution network users on Sky. It's probably just worth making the distinction between ourselves as the distribution network operator and our colleagues in the transmission business. There's a number of quite active transmission works on Sky, but they kind of fall out with the scope of what we're talking about here. That's picked up by a separate part of the business, and there's some again, coming back to regulation, there's some sort of regulatory barriers and rules there around what is and isn't considered by each part of the business.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, I think that's a good clarification. Obviously, it was in your slide about the difference between transmission and distribution, but often, I think it's fair to say people see SSE, SSEN, and there's understandable confusion around some of that. So I think any clarification as you've made there is always very welcome. Okay, I'm just checking any other questions we've not covered. So maybe just a question from myself here to end. We've got a trail for the forthcoming webinars in the series. So this time next Thursday, we've got the second part of the Heat in the Highland for our mainland audience kind of focus. So do join us. As Keith said, we've got Energy Saving Trust and some industry partners joining us for that call. And then the following week, a fortnight today, Thursday the 26th of September, 10 till 11, we've got the second part of today's session, again, kind of focusing on our islands, local authorities and island communities. So again, Energy Saving Trust will be on the call, as well as industry partners, both supporting and within those communities. So we do hope to see some of you back on that part. Yeah, so the final question, one for Keith here. You mentioned district heating for the islands. Are you considering low ambient network with ground source heat pumps, or a more traditional high temperature district heat network as a base load? I don't know if that's something you can cover. Appreciate this maybe sits with some of the LHEES strategy, but I'll leave that question to you.
It'll be a very place-based and a specific type of technology that will likely suit certain areas, but that will largely be driven out by not just LHEES, but I suspect feasibility work in places where it's expected that district heat will be a feasible solution to decarbonise heat. Mm-hmm. So yeah, not a question I can give a straight yes or no answer to. I think it'll be very location specific.
Yeah, and obviously we do have some heat networks, LOIC, for example, one of the long-established networks. So there is experience within our island communities in terms of the install maintenance of that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see that roll out across other islands in due course, hopefully. Okay, well, I'll draw this morning's webinar to a close. Just want to thank our two speakers, Keith and Stuart, again for your time, and obviously a lot of preparation gone into your slide decks and going through it so thoroughly. We will again be sharing those afterwards, and I'm sure if there are particular questions, we can facilitate follow-up or introductions. As I said in the introduction, if anyone is from any clean heat supply chain partners and hasn't had any one-to-one engagement with the heat source program, please do get in touch through our website, and there's a contact form there. That's probably the easiest route. Again, our newsletter available to sign up to through the website, and that comes out once a month. Finally, just to thank partners and funders for the heat source program, so Irons Enterprise, and obviously Keith here representing them, South of Scotland Enterprise covering Dumfries, Galloway and the borders of Scotland. So if any partners on the call are looking at markets or based in that part of Scotland, we can facilitate introductions to them. And then for the Central Belt, Aberdeenshire, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Scottish Enterprise and their clean heat support team as well. So thank you to all our supporters, and a special thank you to our speakers today. So we'll leave you. You get a few minutes back from your morning, so thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tom.